Hello, Mr. Pancholi. I'm so happy to have you back on Land Cycle Investor for another exciting update of where we are in the destructive cyclical process that's going to bring doom and gloom at some point to our native experiences. How are you?
Well, I'm great, and I love the way you deliver such a pessimistic message with such an optimistic smile on your face. We live in the world of cycles, so pessimism follows optimism, and optimism follows pessimism. So, yeah, what should we talk about today, Catherine? Great to be back. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, no, you're very welcome. You're a popular guest of mine, and I think because you've just got such a great record in timing the markets and looking at these cycles in a way, really, which I think few really do, and that's enabled you to be so accurate on the calls on your market calls that you've had in recent times on both geopolitical and also price forecasts, which has been really fascinating and interesting. And the interviews that we've done so far have generated a lot of discussion and feedback to me based on that, really. And of course, I found it as fascinating myself. So I thought what we could start off today actually was just sort of cycling back to one of the recent interviews that we did where we focused on copper. And we both got extremely excited when we did this interview. It was actually a forecast that you yourself had made, and I did put that in the send out that I sent out, which was that you had actually picked the point of which copper was going to spike, but we saw copper roar up to record highs. That would have been a land cycle forecast because we know historically, in the context of the land cycle, copper being one of the most important building materials, most important materials in construction across a wide range of sectors. Always reaches its high demand point prior to the cyclical crash. So it caused a lot of excitement inside of us. But since doom has come, and the price sort of did a pretty sharp reversal on that. So I haven't addressed it in anything that I wrote. Last week's post was I'm trying to remember what I did write about now. Oh, has America reached the peak of its land cycle was last week's post. So we're
Right.
back to what's happened to our copper forecasts. Shall we have a look at that first?
So let's have a look at copper. So first of all, when we brought it up, there was the biggest spike ever in the histogram system in the history of copper. And of course, we probably got the biggest move ever in the history of copper. The bad news is that it wasn't a sustained move. And that was something that copper's not something that we usually trade when we're trading with our portfolios here. But that wasn't the position we had because the risk was difficult to manage on it. But unfortunately, what we've seen is that the smart money sold very heavily into that move up. So we know that that was an unsustainable move. Unfortunately, we didn't know it at the time. So, we've got to be honest about that. But the amount of smart money selling has increased, and the amount of smart money buying, this is in our master traders platform, where we look at what the commitment of traders data is doing. And if I'm just looking at this on the other screen here. There's a very high level of selling there. So basically, we've come down now to a baseline for those of you who are chartists. You can go back to that low round about 2021, and there's a whole series of lows that are aligned with a trend line, and we're pretty much back to that trend line there. And so I guess we're going to sort of
Or are
see
you,
some support.
do you want to do a
Sorry.
share screen? Do you want to share the screen and show, or do you want to just comment on it?
Yes, I
Yeah,
can certainly do that.
I
Let
have
me just
allowed that, haven't I,
um,
within
make it look a little bit
might be quite
more
interesting for
um, uh, right. Let me do this. Let's share this screen right here. Okay, let me know when you're seeing this, Catherine.
I am seeing it. Yeah.
So here we go. So here's our copper chart. The histograms are in the our own proprietary computer system, but basically that's what we did talk about last time when we got this huge move up. But as you can see, this is the smart money selling. The smart money selling has really gone up, and it's far greater there than the buying. The buying has really been fairly flat, but you can see there's a big increase in selling. So they were selling back into that, and let me just blow this chart up a little bit like this. And you can see if we took these lows here, these points here going all the way back to actually really what I want to do is take this low here and here. And basically, well, these here, you can draw a trend line into those, and we're nearly back at that trend line there, at 2022 low. And you can see that there is really a major support level. So I don't think we're going to get too much lower in this, but I do think that that's an important level. So, this is markets. We can't be right all the time. Yes, we saw the cycle coming in, and unfortunately, it came crashing back down again because there was no follow through. We'd have wanted to see that green line spike up to see where, and we'd want to see it at a higher level as well, like it was back here, which just preceded that sustained move up there. But look, I don't want to go into too much of the technicals with regards to the smart money platform because basically I don't want to bore people to death. It's quite, but yes, that's that. So copper right now is it's had its moment on the stage, and basically we're coming back to a support area.
And your forecast ahead for it, would you expect it to revert?
I would expect it to cling to that trend line and just sort of mosey along up that very gently. But yeah, just go up there very slowly. But at the moment, there's nothing suggesting that it's going to do anything more exciting again. So that was very much a flash in the pan there. Unfortunately, the cycles did catch it, but it was a difficult trade and there was no follow through on it.
Yeah, we should probably circle in that to sort of talking about what's going on, fundamentally in the economy more so than cyclically, but with the Trump's tariffs, because you were talking to me about that just before I hopped on, saying, have you seen the news today? And actually all I've done today is run around working. So I haven't really spent much time on the news today. So why don't you sort of update on what you've been looking at?
So Trump, in his usual game, which he does seem to be treating global politics very much like a reality TV show, and so now he's gone off to he's slapped 50% tariffs on India. I think specifically aimed at the oil arena. This is going to be quite interesting. So 50% tariffs there, and also he's gone to visit Pakistan, and apparently he's having dinner with the leader of Pakistan, and he's not going to meet with anybody in India. So now he's sort of snubbing India, which is one of his usual power plays supposedly. But as well, I think it's fairly ill thought out because what he hasn't really thought of is what this is going to do is it's going to push India away from America and turn it towards China for supply of oil. And the reason, by the way, Trump has had put these oil tariffs on India is because they're buying Russian oil, and now he wants to put pressure on Putin. He's the self sort of you know appointed peacemaker, and he's giving ultimatums. Very dangerous giving ultimatums, and why should the leader of another country listen to that from another place just because he's written a book called The Art of the Deal, trying to make this all a big TV show? Look, I know a lot of you American. I know he's done a lot of good things, and I'm not anti-Trump per se, but I'm anti some of the way he does some of this stuff, and some of his ideas, which I think are quite pathetic at times. And I think this is, all this idea of, well, we'll force them into this, we'll force them into that. And, all this stuff is like buddying up to China, really. But I think what's going to happen here is India is going to move towards China and continue to get oil from Russia. And, what this is going to do, and this is the big point, is it's going to basically refocus everything. It was going to put the BRICS nations under the spotlight and further empower them, in my opinion. And the BRICS nations are many, and a lot of have been joining by by the month, really. So he's creating a greater enemy for himself. But also part of his bigger plan is he wants Greenland, he wants the Panama Canal, and he thinks that maybe these are deals that he can do where he seems to be very pally with China in some ways, even though they're arch enemies. So I think he's playing very much into the hands of China by these moves without realizing it. So, I think, he's also put tariffs on Taiwan and semiconductors, yet they're supposed to be protecting that. And they're concerned that China takes Taiwan. It's almost like, well, you guys have Taiwan and we'll take Greenland. And these are all plays that, Greenland has a tremendous amount of resources. Nobody really cares about it otherwise. It's up there in the Arctic Circle, and unless you're flying, as a passenger or an aviator, you're over that area. There is nothing up there other than a mass of resources. And of course, geopolitically a very strategic place to place nuclear weapons and so on, you know, because you can suddenly reach parts of, well, Russia that you couldn't previously do. So very
Yes.
important thing there. So I think these are the subtleties that are going on underneath everything. But to start a fight with India, you know, one of the largest nations, you know, they always said that China and India were two of the most prolific, you know, powers there. And India really, you know, they talk in economics, we talk about labor and capital. Well, you know, India has labor, has a lot of people there. China historically has had capital, really, you know, as well as labor. So these are powerful nations, and playing these games isn't really going to impact very well for America, the way I see it, because it's just pushing former allies into the arms of other people now enemies of the United States. So this kind of is creating this great power shift. It continues to do that. I think a lot of this stuff is knee-jerk stuff. I think he's sort of trying to do his game show stuff, force them into a deal, do this, do that, and it's all very short term. But of course, you know, the US presidential system allows for a 4-year term, maximum 8. He's trying to make it indefinite, or at least he was talking about that. And that's why these Western economies, we live in Western economies, don't do so well, because we have democracy in inverted commas, whereas China almost certainly has a 100-year plan. We certainly know it has 5-year and 10-year and 20-year plans, as too does Russia. So I think this whole thing is really interesting, Catherine, because I think it's going to really sort of shift the balance of power. And of course, part of the BRICS issue then is all about the dollar, and this idea of potentially the BRICS nations. And the BRICS nations, you know, they speak different languages, they have different currencies, they have different cultures. There is nothing really tying them together. At least the Western nations all speak English, right? So you've got that common language and so on. And but the idea here is that there was a threat developing, which I wrote about last year quite a bit, and previous years, whereby if the BRICS nations developed a central bank digital currency backed by all the gold that China's been buying, they would have a very, very strong currency that would really challenge the dollar. But of course, Trump has seen this coming, and this actually is a smart move, where he's now, you know, brought in the Genius Act and the idea that the dollar can be tied to cryptocurrencies and so on, and that in itself would effectively protect the dollar. So that's kind of an interesting game there. And of course, you know, the euro arguably is under threat if Europe continues to break up, and if Russia makes more inroads into Europe, then I think that will be a problem. Yeah, I think so. That will be a problem. So there's some thoughts there. Let me bounce it back to you, Catherine.
Well, I mean, I think that it's kind of like that. This is where we're sort of getting onto the end of cycle stuff because, you know, if we look about, you know, it's not so much about, you know, the conditions in the cycle that produce the economic downturns. Because if we're talking about a cycle, yes, you know, there's going to be times of good and there's going to be times of bad. There's going to be times of feast and there's going to be times of famine. But if you have an economic system that doesn't buffer against that, then the conditions for the economic collapse when you hit the times of bad become very intense. And I think that is why you get this kind of economic cyclical repeat. Certainly within the land cycle, we have the lands predominantly lending for speculation. That speculation drives up land prices. The productive sectors of the economy can't sustain the debt. Because they get eroded away by that process. And then eventually we get this collapse, and then the whole thing gets reinflated again. It corrects itself through the collapse to some extent, and then off we go again. I mean, and I think this is the similar thing when we're talking about the war cycle. And so what you're talking about, which is the battle between hegemonic powers. And we've seen this coming for some period of time, but the timing in this is quite pivotal, isn't it? Now, I, of course, am talking about that within the context of the 18-year land cycle, which is, to me, the most important one that kind of sits at the base of all of
Yeah.
the cycles. We read all the others in context of that. But, you know, if we're sort of looking for, you know, the tensions rising into the peak of that, the tensions rising into the peak of the Kondratiev cycle, which is a similar land-based economic pattern that happens, then we're looking at the timing for these things to sort of potentially erupt. And I did notice that with Trump and the cryptocurrency, and I had quite a few subscribers send me articles about that. I think that there's a sort of sense of the amount of speculation that is going into cryptocurrency, which, unlike gold, doesn't have a physical aspect to it.
Has no intrinsic value whatsoever. I still don't understand it. You know,
Mm.
I'm going to be the first to raise my hand, so I have no idea what it is because everybody else professes to be an expert in it. I'm clueless.
Because then what I think is almost inevitable is the collapse, the speculative rush into crypto when it gets backed by this, of which we are seeing and we have seen the way that crypto is then being used in. Well, I mean, one of the things that I wrote about the other week, I don't know whether it was last week or whether it was the week before, to come to think about it, or even the week before that. It was to do when I wrote about gold and Bitcoin, but it was about the migration of crypto into the land market, so
Yeah.
being used for mortgage lending, being able to be used for transactions, making transactions immediate. I mean, we've seen that develop throughout this cycle. So really from around 2017, 2018 was when it sort of entered the real estate market. And now we've got, very big influences in the US that are setting up funds, of cryptocurrency to go and buy big real estate projects with it. And you sort of think to yourself, this can't help but end badly. Is that sort of how you see it occurring as well?
I don't know if it's going to end badly, but I think it's bringing in a whole new. I mean, yeah, I mean the odds are that it will it will more than likely end badly, but there are too many factors, and every time you hear this time it's different sort of thing or whatever. But we're actually, I don't want to say we're in new territory, but we're in different territory. I think that's really it. So, but like you say, the 18.6 year cycle does work really well. All these things are kind of discounted in it. You're more of an expert on that than I am. So I just think we need to be cautious because we've created something in cryptocurrency that has no intrinsic value. Yet people have become, there are even people I know in normal jobs who got in early and just, did hold on for dear life. They're worth 200-300 million and they've got a regular job. And it's magic money, isn't it? What's it made of? That's the whole point. So let me give you another angle on this. What happens if we lose power? What happens if we get a load of cyber attacks? Because that's going to be the new form of warfare. How are you going to access your crypto then? How are you going to access your money then? Actually, that's something worth thinking about. I think
Well,
that's
I
a
think,
really big.
yeah, I was going to jump in and say, I think we need to think about that because this is the other. It's funny because all of these things are kind of left over from COVID. I remember when COVID hit, and obviously being in Melbourne, we suffered one of the longest lockdowns in the world. And, it was a horrific time to live in Melbourne, particularly when for myself, it wasn't pleasant going through that period of time. And of course, it brought all this authoritarianism into play. And it was interesting to see how that impacted the population. But since COVID, you always find when you get these crises, some of those legislative things which are enacted at the time uh, continue on, a little bit like when we saw at 9/11 with the anthrax attacks and the September 11th attack, where you saw, well, this is your industry, in the aviation industry, those extra security measures never really came off. They just kind of get built on.
Yeah.
Um, on top of that, I'll let you go in a second, but I just wanted to mention it in terms of the what you were talking about there with the power going off, because we had that great big power outage, didn't we, not so long ago in Spain and Portugal, I think it was.
Yes.
That huge power outage, but wasn't it written into the World Economic Forum's Great Reset? They had their Great Reset documentation that came out through COVID, and part of that was warning against a power shutdown. And I think the contrarian narrative that was built into that around the move towards net zero is that we're then going to have on top of that, there's a move towards doing climate shutdowns, energy shutdowns, in order to preserve different sources of energy, which we're now going to be using rather than relying on. Well, that's the policy, is they don't want us to rely on coal and oil anymore.
Yeah. So, that's a really interesting point. Like, I mean, obviously Trump is all for coal and fossil fuels, and I think fossil fuels are going to make a comeback. But yes, the World Economic Forum and these bodies are all looking for green energy. And it looks like, obviously these things are still in pioneering days. And whether it was a deliberate outage or a cyber thing or whatever, but the power did go out, and a lot of people were impacted by that huge outage, which they really just sort of put down to the infrastructure, the new infrastructure not being able to cope with that level of power demand. But I don't think we actually got to the bottom of what actually caused that, did we? I don't think anybody ever came out with an answer. But I think you raise a very good point there. Yes. So during that time period, which I think was over 24 hours for some, I've got a very good friend, very wealthy friend down in Portugal, who has a big estate down there and keeps his yacht tied up off um, you know, um, one of the local ports there. He was completely out. In fact, I was actually talking to him on the phone, and he said everything had gone dark. And then, well, maybe it's the usual thing. Well, it's the Western modern world. It'll be on back in about 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes further chat, there was no sign of anything. So he said, I better preserve the battery life in my mobile phone. I mean, fortunately, he's got generators there, but that is something that we're not really prepared for anymore. And I think a lot of people will say that they can last longer without water than they can without Wi-Fi these days.
Yes,
So
probably would do. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very real fear. It was funny over that time that how you saw people pass their time because they all sort of went out onto the street to find community. Whereas most of the time, with the fourth monkey, so we hear nothing, see nothing, say nothing because we've all got our heads down looking at phones or, doing what I do, just staring at the computer most of the day. But yeah, I mean, I suppose the curiosity is how all of this is going to play out. And when I speak to Fred Harrison, so Fred Harrison, you're familiar a little bit with his work. He doesn't so much look at the cyclical time periods as you would do, the yearly counts and in your own models that you use to identify turning points in the markets. But he's a historian and an economist and looks back at the patterns of history to define the cycles. And he's always felt that at the end of this cycle, we're facing four existential crises, a climate crisis, an economic crisis, a migrant crisis, which we can get on into in a minute, and a war crisis, because he feels that when I'm interested in your thoughts on this one in particular, when the economic system collapses, which we're forecasting will happen, sort of as a downturn into 2028, nobody will have trust in the monetary systems anymore for the governments to bail us out. I don't know that I quite align with that one completely, but I'm wondering what your thought is on that. And of course, then the other ones we can sort of get into. But his feeling is that it's going to be a monumental economic collapse at that point because of this loss of trust in the monetary system, the transit to digital currency, the Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies that have made their way. Will they survive? Won't they survive? Can you trust governments that are this much in debt?
well, I think that's a really good question. I mean, first of all, from my point of view, I look at different cycles. Obviously, I look at the 18-year cycle as well. But one of the cycles that underscores this is this notion of that we will be 100 years on from the 1929 boom and bust, effectively, the 1929 crash. So the 1920s saw this roaring bull market. Yes, there was a pause partway through it. And then we went to this huge high on the 3rd of September 1929. The Dow Jones Industrial Averages hit a price of 386, and then carried on all the way down to a price of 34 on the 7th of July 1932. So, we did see this 2.5, 2 and 3/4 year pullback in this huge financial crisis and a huge depression. So I think we've got to bear that in mind. And I think I've mentioned this before. The other thing, though, this time that's going to come in is this idea of that we're going to be 90 years on from the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. So we're going to see a war cycle coincide with an economic crash cycle. And I think that's an important time window. And there are other reasons to suggest, obviously, if you use the 18.6-year cycle, this going to comes further forward. I don't think it's going to come further forward with the level of magnitude, but does come further forward, as early as 2020, late 26, 27, something like that. And certainly for my work shows that 2028 is going to be critical. So, if it all gets too easy, aligning a 100-year cycle and a 90-year cycle, and everybody's waiting for 2029, chances are things will probably come before then. So I do think we have to be aware, and it's for this reason I do think that yes, we did put a video out just a few hours ago looking at a smaller turning point on the US equity market, because there are some interesting signs, and maybe we can talk about that one, or we can pop that out to your point your people in that direction a bit later. But the idea is that the big picture does suggest the markets will carry on up towards the back end of this decade, albeit bearing in mind that we are in the winner's curse, as people who look at that 18.6-year size Fred Harrison and Phil and everybody talks about Akil and yourselves, you're all good, got good angles and good aspects in this cycle. So I think this is really important. So that was that. And with regards to the currency side of things, it's a tough call, but what we will see is that as we go into the early 2030s, we're going to be 100 years on from when a lot of countries came off the gold standard. So I think there's going to be some big issues with regards to currencies then, definitely in 2031 to 2034. But ultimately, we live in the world of cycles, so everything changes and everybody recovers, and we have another boom and then we have another bust, and we never learn, and we follow the same patterns, albeit with a slight variation and variety, a bit of variety each time. So does that answer your question? I've sort of gone off on a bit of a rant there, right?
Yeah, no, I'm happy when you go off on rants, because I think it's we never plan what we're going to talk about on these Zooms. We sort of launch on and have a chat. But I think it's quite interesting hearing your thought process on it. The winner's curse, that I always think this is it was the term that Fred coined, for this point in the land cycle. But it was very much with the focus on what was happening in the land markets. And I think one of the aspects when we look at the 18-year cycle, and one of the reasons that it stands apart, is because land is so fundamental to everything that we do. And it's the item that we all need, we all eat from and sustain our lives from. It provides us with all our energy needs. And it's the component of which the financial industry is pinned to as well. So it is important to notice what's going on in the land market. And with this idea of that, Fred noticed these patterns when he was looking back at it, that for the time period where you have data, where you can look at what's happening to the median price in property, over the last 2 years of the land cycle, he would see this ramp up in speculation, which makes sense, because you have to have that boom and that blow off in order to get the bust that comes after it. It doesn't mean that it happens in every market, and I've certainly seen in Australia it's been a little bit patchy. We're seeing the markets improve now in Australia, and they're starting to pick up, and Melbourne's starting to pick up, which is fantastic. But when I look overseas at the US, as a whole, and look at the US, what's going on in its median price, and the dynamics in terms of the amount of inventory on the market, what's happening with rents, what's happening with prices, and in particular, what's happening with building stocks over there, the market is softening, which was what last week's post was about. So it's not saying we don't necessarily have a little bit more to go, but it's not looking grand hot over there. And I think when I spoke to you, you said the same about the UK property market. You've noticed that that's had a bit of a slowing down as well. Is that right?
Yeah, there's definitely signs of softening here in the UK property and land markets. You can see that. But I will say something else. I was in London yesterday, just meeting clients and so on, and I haven't been up for a few weeks, and I was just quite amazed at the amount of activity that was going on there economically. Everything was jammed and packed, and a lot of money is changing hands. Now, I don't know if that money is tourist money. That is obviously an element of tourist money, but there's a lot of foreign people living here, with a lot of very wealthy people living here. So yeah, so there is a lot of economic activity going on, let's say that. The other side of it is that we've got this government that I personally do not support, who are really amateur. There we've got a Chancellor of the Exchequer who professed to be some leading light at a major investment firm and turned out was just there doing customer support. And clearly, these people do not know what they're doing. They do not know how to run an economy. They've been raising taxes beyond belief. We've had so many billionaires and ultra wealthy people leave Britain in the last few weeks and months, relocate either in Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, somebody's gone to Italy, and so on. These are major people. These are real bastions of British industry. The people who've created multi-billion dollar multinational corporations, they are leaving. They are voting with their feet. So I think we should be aware of that. Of course, having democracy in inverted commas means that they're blaming this on the previous administration and who blamed it on the previous administration and so on, and off it goes. And therefore, we're up against even more taxation. And so this is not looking good. So, all this is, and that's why when we spoke last time, I do think the British pound is under threat, and we're seeing the first signs of a topping coming in there. Um, so, um, 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 yeah, I do think that in Britain things are pretty bad, and I think that's going to follow through to the housing and land market without a shadow of doubt.
We'll see how it goes, because I do know from the perspective of Britain and the US, because they're much bigger populations, you tend to get that peak in the median price, as a bit of a leading indicator quite in advance of where any economic downturn is going to come. So we'll sort of see how that plays out. But I wanted to get onto the migrant question and also the increased in tensions. And I think this plays a little bit into conversations that I've had with David Murray as well, which is that the entropy that is built into the cycle. What causes the fall of empires, and it's this kind of turning in on itself as well. He can always express these things so much better than I can when it comes to talking about it. But we're seeing rising tensions, not only between countries, so not only what's going on in the Middle East, and not only what's been going on in Europe. And as you say, we've got this hegemonic stuff that's going on between the monetary systems as well, between the BRICS nations, and, the challenge to the dollar's exorbitant advantage, if you like. The other thing that we have is the protests that happened in the US not so long ago, that were happening in LA over there. So internal disputes, we're seeing it in Australia with mass protests going on between pro-Palestine groups, shutting down Sydney Harbour Bridge. Not only that, those groups, they're not just pro-Palestine groups in terms of a human rights type of thing. We're seeing the carrying of posters of the Iranian leader. There was an ISIS flag that was paraded down Sydney Harbour Bridge, and the Australian flag burnt in Melbourne at the same time. And these are horrific things to see, because these are challenges to the very democracy that you live in, and they're not challenges from just a minority of protesters. They're challenges from what was estimated of 100,000 protesters shutting down Sydney Harbour Bridge, and a large number parading around in Melbourne. I've seen the same in areas of Europe, certainly in London. This, to me, is the demise of strong nations, where you get these internal disputes, because then the focus goes inwards rather than on defending the country and building the defense of the nation. And so, and with that has to be a flip. And this is where it kind of ties into your monthly report, which you sent me. I'm going to put a link into the report that I write going out on this, because your reports are incredibly insightful and jam-packed of information in terms of turning points in the market as well. But some of the commentary on this was about the turn to authoritarian governments, the turn to nationalism on the back of it. So we now start to see this kickback against migration and strong policies. Do you want to extrapolate a little bit on your thoughts surrounding that?
Tell you what, yeah, there's so much you just came out with there, right? So you're seeing all these protests. So just looking at you've got to look at this all impartially in the world of cycles and how history repeats, because things are repeating in a 90-year pattern as well. But you have to think, well, why are all these people protesting everywhere? What is it that's upsetting them, and why are they doing this? So, because we have a Western narrative, and they have a different narrative, and it's worth looking at their narrative as well and seeing what's going on, because then you start understanding what's going on. So I'm not going to go down that road because there's so much going on there. And but what I am going to do is address what you've just mentioned, because the big time cycles are coming in on migration. Migration is not going away. Migration has always been an issue. It's been a huge issue really since all the way back in from 1620, when people were settling in America and so on. And if you look at this, the number of times America has stopped migration and restricted it only to white people, for example, that's something that you'll see. People are, not aware of that. Yet, who are the First Nation people of America? Who are the First Nation people of so many, of Australia, of so many different countries? It's kind of interesting. The settlers come in and then they don't want any more settlers. So that's kind of the irony of this whole situation. But yes, there is this idea of that there are peaceful settlers, positive settlers, entrepreneurial people that make the place better, and there are others that come in and really create problems. And that's what we're seeing. And this is coming to a head right now. In fact, even in the town where I live in Britain, just a day before yesterday, I was out in town, and I know quite a lot of the people in coffee shops and all the rest of it, just right, and some of the stores, and I've got a lot of friends, and they were saying actually we've had an uptick in crime here because the hotel, which is not too bad a hotel here, is suddenly being taken over by the government and they're putting migrants in. So one of the issues here that's really strong in Britain is migrants are coming in, being given giving decent accommodation, being fed and being given allowances, yet people that have fought as veterans, who are disabled, are not really getting any support. And you can see why this is annoying everybody. And not only that, the crime rate then goes up as well. I'm not saying everybody's bad, but the point is this is not good, and it's very polarizing. And that's even down here into the local place that I live in, which is a pretty nice place. It's it's a nice place to be, and it's not the sort of thing you'd expect. So that's the first thing, right? The next thing is when we look at what's going on, and if you fine tune the cycles, as we get into, in fact, we're in this window right now, and now as we change seasons, as we get into the next quarter, this is really going to become a huge issue now everywhere. This is going to be the crux of everything. Now we know Trump effectively said, right, no more migration from all these different people in countries and so on, and he listed that. Also, they are repatriating people. You got to see what happened in 30 years ago. People were suddenly 90 years ago, what you saw in Germany, exactly that. Suddenly people were made minorities. People were being in fact, very much so. 90 years ago this month, that legislation came in to actually make certain people very much second class or worse case citizens, to the point where they would then be terrorized. So you can see there's a huge marginalization of groups of people. And everybody has a view. It's either right or wrong. I don't want crime going up in my town, so obviously I have a view on that. But equally, why is this happening? Well, people are always in search of better economic conditions for themselves, all right? Aren't we all? That's it. I'm from a migrant family that arrived here 60 odd years ago or whatever. Obviously I'm not an Anglo-Saxon Brit. So you can see how all this is happening, but it's the way in which it happens. And what's now happened is that it's got out of control, right? And that's the issue. And I think this is when it gets out of control, it gets to a peak, and then we do end up in exactly this set of polarization, which leads to warfare or huge fallouts and great division and massive polarization. That's what we're seeing. And the cycles suggest to me, given back what was going on in the history of America, I focus on America, so we have a lot of fans in America. We have a lot of fans in Australia as well. And you can see how this division is coming up. And I was talking to somebody from Australia literally day before yesterday who's visiting over here. And she was saying exactly that. There is a noticeable increase in polarization and division. Exactly that. She's popped up from Sydney. And you can see that she's, back in Australia, it's becoming really evident. So I guess this is the cycle, whether we like it or not, this idea of lack of boundaries and borders on migration, and that in itself, in many ways, when we go into a previous wave of migration in Britain, we had a lot of Eastern European people coming over. And that the point there was they were taking up the jobs nobody in Britain wanted to do. They all became excellent plumbers and certain parts of building and so on that you know they really had skills in that we didn't have. So they effectively filled in the gap, but they also merged in very well. Whereas now we're seeing groups that tend to remain polarized within their own communities. And I think that's one of the issues as well. There's a lack of merging in with the local communities. So this is big. Cycles wise suggest that as we get into the third week of September, this is really going to become a huge issue. It's going to become an issue for everybody globally. It really is going to be in the world eye. Now, this is really, really quite interesting. And, you know, we're seeing, in fact, I think in Britain, there's going to be a demonstration around about the 15th of September in London, which, you know, they're already part of that demonstration is being fueled by the far right. And but also the interesting thing is there are a lot of normal people in there as well. Okay, so you know who do feel very strongly. You know, why should we sit here paying huge amounts of taxes, even more taxes, just to fund other people when there are people more needy that should be funded? And that, you know, you could say that, and you could apply that to any of the Western democracies, right? Exactly what you're saying. Now, the political side of why you're getting demonstrations for other groups, that's slightly different to the migration situation. That's more a geopolitical situation. But yes, what you're saying, as you said, you know, that this is entropy kicking in. I mean, entropy by definition of its word, I would say there is no such thing because, I mean, what we could, because it should all fall into cycles, right? But I guess we could have cycles of peaks and drop and falls in entropy. So these are tough questions. This is a tough subject to talk about. I'll be upsetting, you know, people there. You know, you and I in this presentation will probably upset people, but it's something that everybody's thinking that needs to be addressed, and it's part of the cycle. It's very much part of the cycle. And you know, migration. You know, there are obviously for migrants, the migration cycle starts with a push factor. It ain't working for them where they are. So when you go back in history, we had the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. That prompted a huge amount of Irish migration to America and even Europe, but more so America. And so, you know, these are all kind of interesting things. That those all tied up with food-related economic conditions. Presently, we're just tying up with politically related conditions more so than economic conditions, I think, and also lifestyle conditions and so on. So it's not good. I don't know what to say. I mean, those are my thoughts on it. We are definitely getting into higher levels of disorder. There's no doubt about it. I was expecting that, well, realistically, we could argue that that will increase as we go on into the back end of this decade. With America, of course, this ties in with civil war cycles, and those civil war cycles are in play now, and they escalate all the way through to 2027. I think we spoke about this during a presentation we did where, you know, we see the 60-year anniversary back in 2023 from the point where everybody was made equal and given a vote, and you know, back in America. But in so doing, it really also created a huge surge in things like the KKK. You know, the right-wing organizations didn't want that, and this escalated all the way through to the 60-year anniversary in 1967 when Martin Luther King was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel there in Memphis. So you can see that 60-year pattern, you know, which is arguably part of an 18-year cycle in some ways, is a very important pattern there.
Yeah.
Because if you, yeah,
as as is the 90-year pattern. I mean, they're all harmonics of that 18-year pattern. I think it's really interesting what you say. I don't have a problem offending people at all on this because I think it's fairly obvious, really. I mean, you're
we should
absolutely
speak it as it is because there'll be a lot of people agreeing with us as well. And you know, we're not into this woke thing, so let's say it as it is, Catherine. And people, you know, can agree and disagree, but you know, we've got to see things as they are. And it's all easy to put the woke plaster and paint on and pretend it's not happening and everything because it is happening because cycles happen. That's it. That's what we do. That's our work, Catherine. You and I, we look at cycles and we use them to predict and protect. So I think that's great. So yes, sorry,
yes,
we're agreeing that we're not. So
yes.
we're not keeping you all happy. That's it. But
Well, I mean,
tough, right?
I think it's fairly common sense, to be honest, because you obviously have people want better economic conditions for themselves, which is why they migrate towards democratic market economies that, even though they're not, I'm a Georgist, so they're not Georgist in nature, they're some form of capitalism, actually don't. It's interesting, the term capitalism, because in a true capitalist economy, you wouldn't allow monopoly, because a monopoly is the enemy of capitalism. It's the enemy of market economies, if you like, because you can't have free competition when there's companies that are allowed to monopolize. And of course, Georgism is all about controlling monopoly. But when you come over to those favorable economic conditions, what breaks down is where the terms of engagement break down. And when you get migrants that are coming in that are wanting to impose a different religious system, or when they're burning the flag of the country that they've entered into, then that's where they're actually committing war on the country that they've come into.
Well, hang on a minute. We have to be careful, because you've got to understand. You'd have to agree with where let's make this very clear. You'd have to agree where those people are coming from, but you have to understand where they're coming from. So yeah, at one level, they are sort of at war with the host nation, but then why are they doing this, right? It's probably because the host nation's involved with a war against them. So yeah, I agree, it's not really acceptable, but the point is, you've got to understand where they're coming from, because
Well,
America, Britain back so many different countries. Take the Ukraine situation. If you talk to Russians, they actually think Putin's done a great job of developing the Russian economy. They think he's a great guy, and he puts up with no nonsense. And Ukraine's a really good example, because the Western nations did not stick to the treaties that were agreed to. And if you're sitting in Russia, I mean, look, put it this way: when Western nations have somebody that transgresses what they believe in, they're usually quick to act and intervene. That they will do that, but somebody else is intervening against where Western nations have transgressed, and I think that's a big issue. And we don't tend to understand that, because we all have a viewpoint. So I
well,
think that's something you do have to understand. But it's not acceptable to go and close the harbour bridge down and everything else. I understand that as well. But what is it they're feeling so strong about? What is it that Australia, Britain, America are doing to other countries? Who are they supporting that's quashing their people, and why are they
well,
doing it? And these are the questions to ask. And that way you understand cycles. And you have to look at the hardest bit about it is looking this unemotionally and from a detached manner, because that's how these things are discovered. So we have to separate them all out. And of course, it's very difficult for most people to do. Sorry, back to you, Catherine, you were saying.
Well, I personally feel that if you allow people, if you are looking at this unemotionally, as a country that wants to retain its internal structure to enable it to defend itself against other nations,
Yeah.
then obviously that country does have a responsibility to create an economic system that doesn't cause distress. But at the same time, it cannot allow people to come in that burn its flag and indicate that they would be traitors to that country if the country's status on the international platform were to be threatened. And that, I think, is the problem for any nation.
Yes.
And you can disagree with what's happening in the Middle East between whichever side you oscillate to, and you can do the same between America and the Eastern Russia, and between Russia and Ukraine. But at the same time, those countries are very, very clear on the fact that when you're at war, you're either for the
Yeah.
country or you're against the country, and there is no shade in between. And I think this is the problem of where we're currently heading globally, and we know it's cyclically as well. So of course, whenever we're trading or wherever we're trying to work out what's going to go on, you're absolutely right. We have to employ a balanced understanding of a balanced non-partisan understanding, a balanced understanding of exactly dispassionately how we're going to be able to read this in order to forecast what is ahead. But we also know that we're heading towards a period where war is highly likely. So you talked about what was happening, of course, 90 years ago in 1935, and the immigration problems that began to happen around the Jewish people, and then following that, the gypsy populations and everything that Nazi Germany was starting to employ, where they were becoming very clearly second-class citizens, and then which led to the Holocaust. And 90 years, we're heading to similar reverberations. However it's going to play out, it's playing out very similarly between, what is happening in the Middle East and there's a broader community of Jewish people, because there's a lot of Jew hatred and an anti-Semitic hatred and anti-Zionist hatred, which really is the same thing. If only for anybody that does understand Judaism and exactly what the word Zionist initially meant. And then, of course, also the what's going on in the Middle East with the pushing of the populations and the dominating of
Yeah.
the populations in Gaza, and being pushed out of there, having the entire place flattened, having limited resources and being fought over like pawns, with people like Trump saying we'll just buy Gaza and do what we want with it, this strategic piece of land of which they have no control, and then a domineering force like Hamas, of course, which is no help in this equation at all. So I think that's where you would see the reverberations of a similar thing that's going on. But in the cyclical term, don't we always see that before either an economic crisis or a war?
Definitely, we're seeing that because that becomes a factor related to it, and that's exactly it. And in the timing system, that's exactly why we've brought it up now. That's why I've written it in the latest report, because as we head into September, and in fact, even today, tomorrow, very critical dates for all this stuff. So watch the news very carefully. Just be aware that this is really going to escalate to the point of extreme tension, especially as we get to the change of season around about the 21st of September. It's a very important point. So I totally agree with you, and I think you, in what you've just said, you've summed up all of the global, well, some of the global situations really nicely. You've exactly nailed it exactly. That basically all these differences of opinion, we've gone from globalization, and harmony, to polarization and entropy, is the word you used there, and so on. So I think this is, yeah, and from a cycle point of view, which is what we talk about, which is what I do, is this is where the cycle is coming to an important trigger point. I'm not saying it's coming to a peak, because I think there's a lot more to follow, but I'm thinking this is coming to a flashpoint right now, definitely.
I agree with you. I'm wondering whether that's almost a good point for us to pause this conversation,
Okay.
because we do have so much more to talk about, and as you're somebody that I want to have back regularly, on Land Cycle Investor, to discuss these things, particularly in what lay ahead, because we're at such a pivotal point in the cycle. But now you're here, I want to sort of spruik the products that you've got that you sell, because I think they're very complementary to the work that I do, and the work that we do together. And that is, at the moment, your monthly market timing report has come out for the month of, where are we now? August.
Yeah, yeah.
You can't quite believe we're August. It'll be Christmas again soon, and then the whole thing will start again. The whole year will start again. We'll be into 2026 talking about it. So what I'll do is I'll put a link to that report out. But I should mention to people that your subscriptions, they're not just big, great subscriptions. People can buy singular monthly reports to have a look and to see what it is that you write about. But I will stress, and I don't, that I will, don't say this about many people, but your record of accuracy is absolutely incredible. And the people that I do know that have subscribed to your products, and the ones that I've been talking to, are really thirsty for that information. And I've spoken very highly about the information that you're putting out. So I do encourage people to have a go and to buy a report and take a look at what it is that you do. And of course, I'll have you back here to talk about the cyclical trends and what's going on in the markets. But yeah, that's right. Is you have different levels of membership that people can do. They can buy a once-off monthly report.
What we've done this time is, if people want to try it as a one-off, then there's a link that you've got. It's a full and final sale. Get the latest report and you can see it. And basically that's that. There's no, as I said, it's full and final. There's no refund on that. If you want to subscribe and have a go and you haven't already done that, then we do offer a trial with a money back guarantee for for 28 days. So Catherine, you've got those links there. Pop them out there. Then also, we have, for those of you actively trading, investing, there are some other products there, including the market timing report trading course, which we teach the system. I used to run a fund. I'm still doing quite a lot of work in that arena. And those are the same techniques we used. That fund closed up 34%, beating the S&P by 47% in the last year it was running. That was 3 years ago. It was the last year before we closed the fund down and returned the money to the investors. And then we have the smart money platform, which we looked at briefly, where you can see what markets are about to move on a longer term basis, where tops are coming in, where bottoms are coming in. Then we have the seasonality platform, which is for shorter term traders and investors. And in fact, since we last talked about that, we've put an investing option in there that gives you trades of several weeks as well. Of course, you've got to manage the risk, you've got to know how to do that, you've got to use it with your own trading system. And if you don't have one, as I say, the market timing report trading course does all that. So those are the things there. And yeah, thank you. So as I say, if you just want to try it with no risk, whatever, there is that one-off link that you've got there, Catherine. And if people wanted to try a subscription, which also renews, then that's the other links that you've got there as well. So
Yeah.
we look forward to having you on board. And I'll be the first to say, for you Australians, it's like Vegemite. For the Brits, it's like Marmite. And in America, I don't know what you'd say, but people love it or they hate it. There's nothing in between. Our work's very precise, like yours is, Catherine. So hope you enjoy it. And we know it's not for everybody. As in fact, this session will prove. We look at these things and we break through the veils and barriers and get to the bottom of it all, which is very exciting.
I think what's interesting about particularly commenting on these things, it's interesting going through the motions of the cycle, because of course, for example, in 2020, we sort of knew that there was a downturn coming, but you never quite know how it's going to play out, how it's going to impact you emotionally. So, I remember sort of going into that period thinking, oh, it's not going to be a full-on real estate crash. I've got all my investments sort of sorted out and structured and I'll be okay, and ended up being shut down in an apartment for nearly 2 years, which just was not, it was so not fun. I joke with people about what happened to my mental state of mind over there, which I won't disclose here because people might just unsubscribe from me, but I was full on tin mode over that period of time. And then of course, it sort of gets to this point, we travel through, recovery phases of that. And then we get to this point where there's these kind of, we're looking at, like you're looking at these, migration cycles, the immigration policies, and saying we've got these flashpoints. There's David Murray saying war's approaching. There's Fred Harrison saying totally economic collapse is going on. And, whilst you do look at these things dispassionately, they do inspire strong emotions, which I think is evident in the conversations we have. You're not immune from going through the same emotions that produce the same cycle, even though you stand slightly, back from it and you can look upon it within the context and you can protect yourself and your investments. It's still the emotional trauma of a cycle is still one that plays out in your own lives. God doesn't let you have it that easy, unfortunately, to let you out of, give you the lottery numbers and let you watch from the sidelines.
Well, that's it. But that's the point of cycles, is to try and help you with that, to know what's coming up ahead and be prepared. If you know the tsunami's coming, you can try and get out of the way, but you might not necessarily be able to. But at least it's coming. You can take some attempt at protecting yourself. And I think that's really what this is all about. And for most things, for example, you talked about the pandemic. That was something we did see coming very clearly, and we forewarned everybody about. And it also tied in with the 90-year cycle from the 29 top at the back end of 2019. So we were expecting, the sell-off came within 6 weeks of the end of that. So, a 6-week window in a 90-year cycle is pretty acceptable. And of course, using the histogram system, they were given, our followers given the exact date of the top and the price, actually, because it followed the techniques there in the course. So that's the whole point of these things, is that you can be prepared, at least be prepared for what lies ahead. And whilst maybe today some parts of this conversation might sound a bit concerning or even distressing, don't worry, because the cycles change. Just look after yourselves, and if you don't watch too much of the news. I don't actually watch too much of the news. I just study history to see how it repeats, believe it or not, and then we use that to comment on what lies ahead. So yeah, there we go.
Yes, the only time I turn the news on really in force is when I'm working out in the morning. Sometimes I'll flip the news on it onto the news channel to watch, but it doesn't do much for the yeah, it doesn't do much for my. I usually end up shouting at the television, so it's not great therapy for me to do that. But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on, Andrew. I always have a brilliant time talking to you, and absolutely love corresponding with you. And yeah, we'll do it again really soon, and maybe we'll do. I'll mention this now. Just so that it gets out there on the recording. But let's do a live session again soon and get some subscribers
Yeah.
and get a little bit more interaction going again so that they can have a chance to meet and greet you, so to speak, and ask their questions.
Yeah, that would be fun. It was good fun actually. Last time we did a live, wasn't it? That was good.
Yes.
So yeah, let's do that. If it helps your people, that would be great. I'm more than
Helps my
happy to come back.
people. It helps the fans, Andrew. It helps the fans. So
All right. And I'm
yes.
sure you have many of those, Catherine.
I do. Yeah, okay. All right. We will talk again soon, and thanks again, and yeah, we'll speak soon.
All right. Thanks very much. Thank you so much, Catherine.